There are secrets people carry quietly to their graves, and then there are secrets buried so deliberately, so impossibly deep, that it takes federal investigators, a signed court order, and a team of trained agents moving through darkness with flashlights to find them. Gene Hackman was one of the greatest actors who ever lived. 2 Academy Awards, decades of performances that stopped audiences cold, a man the world trusted completely because he always seemed real, always seemed honest, always seemed like someone who had absolutely nothing to hide. But behind the doors of his sprawling New Mexico estate, behind walls that never appeared on any blueprints, behind a life that grew quieter and more withdrawn than anyone had ever anticipated, something else entirely was waiting. When Gene Hackman and his wife Betsy were found dead in February 2025, the world went still. It was shocking. It was heartbreaking. But what unfolded next transformed that shock into something far more unsettling. Investigators didn't simply find 2 people who had passed away. They found a property that didn't add up, rooms that existed nowhere on record, a structure beneath the earth that no one had reported, no one had documented, and no one, apparently, was ever meant to discover. The FBI was called in, and what they uncovered inside that hidden tunnel changed everything the world believed it knew about Gene Hackman, the man, the legend, and the silent life he had so carefully chosen. This is that story, and it is far stranger than anything he ever put on screen. To truly understand what was found beneath Gene Hackman's property, you first have to understand the man who spent a lifetime building above it. Gene Hackman was not like other Hollywood legends, not even close. He didn't chase the spotlight when the cameras stopped rolling. He didn't fill his retirement years with red carpets, memoir tours, or carefully managed press appearances. When Gene Hackman stepped away from acting, really stepped away, sometime around 2004 after his final film, he did something almost unheard of. In the entertainment world, he disappeared. Not dramatically, not with a press release, a farewell statement, or a last wave from a late-night couch. He simply stopped. He moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico, with his wife Betsy Arakawa, and built a life so deliberately quiet, so intentionally removed from the world he'd once dominated, that years passed without a single confirmed public sighting. People who knew him in Hollywood described a man who had always been complicated, driven and difficult, brilliant and bruising. He came from a broken home. His father abandoned the family when Gene was just 13 years old, a wound that never fully healed, and that many who knew him said cast a shadow over everything that came after. He joined the Marines at 16. He struggled for years before anyone in Hollywood would give him a real chance. He was told, repeatedly, formally, by actual industry professionals, that he simply didn't have what it took to become a star. He proved every single one of them spectacularly wrong, but the cost of that proof was steep. 3 marriages, complicated, fractured relationships with his children, a reputation on set that was equal parts admired and feared. People described his intensity the way they'd describe a force of nature, something you respected, something you carefully worked around, something you never quite got close enough to fully understand. And in retirement, that distance only deepened. His Santa Fe property was expansive, profoundly private, wrapped in the kind of quiet you don't stumble into by accident, the kind you deliberately choose and consciously maintain year after year. Neighbors rarely saw him. Former colleagues rarely heard from him. The man who had once commanded a screen with more raw presence than almost anyone in cinema history had become, in his final years, a ghost in plain sight. So when his death was reported in late February 2025, and when the circumstances surrounding that death began raising questions without easy answers, investigators arrived at his estate expecting to find a reclusive old man's home. What they found, instead, was something none of their training had quite prepared them for. The call came in on a Wednesday. A neighbor living far enough away, that neighbor is almost a generous description, had noticed something felt genuinely off about the Hackman property. No movement, no lights cycling the way they normally did, a heaviness to the stillness that felt different from the usual quiet, though it was difficult to explain in any concrete way. When local law enforcement arrived and made entry, they found Gene Hackman and his wife Betsy inside the home. Both were deceased. The initial assessment pointed toward natural causes. Hackman was 95 years old, and Betsy, though younger, showed no immediately obvious signs of anything suspicious. But something about the property kept quietly nagging at the investigators on scene. It wasn't dramatic at first, just small, persistent things. A door that didn't match the floor plan they'd pulled on arrival. A wall that responded differently when knocked, a hollow sound, where there should have been resistance. Measurements that simply didn't reconcile with the exterior dimensions of the building. They were standing inside. Experienced investigators will tell you that anomalies like these can mean absolutely nothing. Old homes get renovated. Walls get moved. Unpermitted additions happen all the time, especially on large private properties. In an estate this old and this expansive, some irregularity was not only expected, it was normal. But then one agent noticed something outside, behind the main structure, past a garden that had gone slightly wild with New Mexico drought scrub and untended sage slowly reclaiming the ground. There was a subtle depression in the earth, long, narrow, running roughly parallel to the home's back wall. Something that looked less like natural erosion and far more like something deliberate. Something that had been built and carefully covered, and left to look like absolutely nothing at all. They brought in ground-penetrating radar the following morning. The results were unambiguous. Beneath the surface, beginning roughly 4 feet down and extending nearly 60 feet in length, there was a structure, man-made, enclosed, and entirely, completely absent from every architectural record, building permit, and property document ever associated with the Hackman estate. That's when the FBI was formally brought in. The excavation team worked with deliberate care. This was not a rushed operation. Whatever was down there had been there for years, possibly decades, and no one was willing to compromise what was increasingly being treated as a significant discovery. The soil was dry, as expected in Santa Fe, and that dryness had actually preserved the structure in remarkable condition. The tunnel entrance was hidden beneath what appeared to be a purely decorative stone feature. In the garden, the kind of thing that, from any distance, looked ornamental and unremarkable. Up close, with the right eye, it was clearly a hatch, heavy, reinforced, sealed from the inside with a mechanism that required deliberate, knowing effort to operate. When agents finally made entry, they moved slowly, documenting every inch. The tunnel was not rough or improvised. It was lined, climate-controlled, or at least it had been, at some point, with the remnants of a ventilation system still faintly visible tracing one wall. Electrical conduits ran the full length of the ceiling overhead. Whatever this space had been designed for, it had been designed with professional care, with serious intention, and with the clear expectation that it would serve its purpose for a very long time. The deeper agents moved into the tunnel, the quieter the team became, because what they were beginning to find was not what any of them had expected. The first room off the tunnel's main passage was small, maybe 10 feet by 12, walls lined with shelving, floor to ceiling on 3 sides, and those shelves held boxes. Dozens of them, archival quality boxes, the kind used by serious collectors and professional archivists, labeled carefully in a handwriting that agents would later confirm matched Gene Hackman's own. Inside those boxes was a life, not the public life, not the awards, the credits, the celebrated performances that filled textbooks and filled theaters. This was something raw and far more personal, something clearly never intended for any other eyes. There were letters, hundreds of them, spanning entire decades. Letters written to his estranged father, letters that, from what investigators later described to reporters, were never sent, never mailed, simply written, placed carefully into a box, and carried forward with him as he moved through a life defined by distance and unresolved longing. The letters spoke of anger that had slowly softened into something closer to grief, of questions that went permanently unanswered, of a boy who became a man who became a legend, and still could not fully shake the weight of being left behind at 13. There were journals, detailed, almost compulsive journals tracing his career, not as a triumphant story, but as a survival story. Early entries from his New York years, The grinding years when rejection was so constant it had nearly become background noise, described a young man living on the edge, financially desperate, emotionally hollowed, convincing himself, day after relentless day, that the next audition would somehow be different. These weren't the composed reflections of a confident man looking back warmly from comfort. They were written inside the storm, by someone who genuinely didn't know if he would survive it. Further into the tunnel, agents entered a second room. This one felt entirely different, larger, perhaps 20 feet square, and where the first room had felt like an archive, this one felt unmistakably like a sanctuary. There was a desk, a chair worn smooth with use, a reading lamp that still worked when an agent tested the switch, connected to a small battery backup system that had either been maintained or had simply, miraculously, endured. On the desk lay manuscript pages, hundreds of them, carefully organized into what appeared to be several distinct projects. Novels or partial novels, screenplays, long, wandering essays that didn't seem addressed to anyone in particular, yet felt deeply, urgently written. Gene Hackman, it turned out, had been writing, seriously, prolifically writing, not for publication, not for any audience, but entirely for himself, for the same reason he'd kept the journals, written the unsent letters, and constructed this entire hidden world beneath the desert earth in the first place. Because he needed somewhere to put it all. Agents later described a palpable feeling in that room. Not the feeling of crime, not of scandal, but of solitude. Of a man who had spent his entire public life performing brilliantly for others and had, somewhere along the way, quietly decided that the most honest version of himself could only exist in a place where no one else could see. The manuscripts held no great Hollywood revelations, no exposes, no score settling with directors or co-stars who'd crossed him. They were quieter than that, and sadder, and in many ways far more devastating. They were the inner life of someone who had never quite believed, even standing at the absolute peak of fame, that what he showed the world was the real thing. There was a third room at the very end of the tunnel. Agents almost missed it entirely. The door was set flush with the wall and painted to match, no visible handle, no obvious seam. It was a small piece of tape near the baseboard, bearing Betsy's handwriting, that finally drew one investigator's eye downward. Inside was something none of them had anticipated finding in an underground passage beneath a retired actor's desert estate. It was a medical space, not a full clinic, but equipped far beyond anything you'd expect in any private residence. A hospital-grade reclining chair anchored the center of the room. For stands stood at the ready. A small refrigerated cabinet had once held medications, most now long expired. Detailed medical logs filled a row of binders, tracking treatments, charting responses, recording dosages, spanning what appeared to be nearly 15 years of continuous care. The records were deeply personal. They documented a years-long private medical struggle, not Gene's. The agents quickly realized, but Betsy's, a condition diagnosed quietly, managed quietly, treated in this hidden, underground space with a level of sustained care and fierce devotion that investigators could only describe as extraordinary. Gene Hackman had built this tunnel, this entire carefully constructed underground world, in significant part so his wife could receive treatment, in privacy and genuine comfort, protected from a world that had always been too loud, too curious, and too relentlessly present in their lives. He had outfitted it himself, managed the supplies himself, sat beside her in that room through treatments that were frightening and difficult, in a space that no one else on earth knew existed. That discovery changed the entire tone of the investigation. What had begun as a search for answers quietly transformed into something closer to a portrait. The FBI agents who worked that case have not spoken extensively on the record. The investigation touched sensitive personal medical information, and significant legal complexities surrounded what could be disclosed, but those who have spoken, even carefully and in general terms, described a consistent feeling as the evidence was cataloged and the full picture slowly emerged. This was not a man hiding something shameful. This was a man protecting something sacred. The tunnel, with its archive of unsent letters, unpublished manuscripts, and medical equipment, told the story of a private self that the public Gene Hackman, the one who glared from movie posters, won Oscars, and inspired decades of devoted film school lectures, had kept carefully sealed off from everything outside. He had written about his father in those journals for 50 years. He had never resolved that pain. He had simply carried it forward, written about it honestly, and placed those writings into boxes in a room where no one would find them, until he was already gone. There was something almost unbearably human in that image. The greatest actor of his generation, the man whose entire craft rested on externalizing emotion with shattering, breathtaking precision, keeping the deepest emotions of his own life locked beneath the desert earth. And then there was Betsy, always Betsy, in the journals, in the manuscripts, in the treatment logs maintained with the precision of someone who had quietly made her health the absolute central project of his final years. The love recorded in those pages was not sentimental. It was practical and fierce and complete. When the story of the tunnel finally became public, surfacing through court documents and investigative reporting, rather than any official statement, the reaction was unlike anything the entertainment world had seen in years. People who had spent years quietly speculating about Hackman's reclusive final decades found themselves reframing everything. They thought they'd understood. The disappearance from public life that had seemed strange, even slightly unsettling, suddenly made an entirely different kind of sense. He hadn't retreated from the world because he was bitter, broken, or afraid. He had retreated because the world inside that Santa Fe estate, inside that quiet property, inside that tunnel, mattered more to him than anything the public world could ever offer. Former co-stars who had once spoken of his intensity, his difficulty, his formidable emotional armor, began quietly reassessing. The very walls that had made him so challenging to work alongside had also, apparently, made him capable of a private devotion that was total and absolutely unwavering. In retirement, he had turned all of that fierce intensity inward, toward Betsy, toward his writing, toward the slow and honest work of genuinely understanding a life that had never once been simple. His children spoke, briefly, carefully, about a father who had been absent in the early years and present later in ways that were complicated and insufficient and achingly real, about a man who was never easy to fully know, about receiving, following his death, actual letters mailed by an attorney on Hackman's prior instructions, containing handwritten notes prepared years in advance for exactly this eventual moment. Those letters, by every account, were extraordinary, personal in ways his public persona never permitted, direct in the way only someone who has genuinely run out of time for indirectness can be. The estate itself, now fully and carefully documented, told a story that would take years to completely absorb. In the archive room, tucked among the hundreds of labeled boxes at the very back of the bottom shelf, investigators found something they almost overlooked entirely. A single plain envelope marked with just one word in Hackman's handwriting. Enough. Inside was a single page. Not a letter, not a journal entry, not another manuscript draft. Just a list, handwritten in careful, deliberate strokes, numbered from 1 to 32. 32 things that Gene Hackman had considered the most important moments of his entire life. Not the Oscar wins, not the great, career-defining performances, not the reviews or the accolades or the watershed moments that appear in every retrospective ever assembled in his honor. The list was entirely personal. Quiet moments with Betsy, moments with his children during the years he'd finally learned to be genuinely present for them. A specific afternoon in New Mexico when rain fell for the first time in months, and he stood outside and felt, for reasons he left unexplained, that everything was somehow going to be all right. A single conversation with a Marine friend he hadn't spoken to in decades. Small things, quiet things, the kind of moments that never once appear in obituaries. Investigators later described it as the single most striking thing discovered anywhere in the tunnel. Not because it revealed anything scandalous or secretive, but because it revealed, with absolute and devastating clarity, what Gene Hackman had actually valued, what had genuinely constituted a life worth living. In his own private reckoning, the world had given him everything it had to give, And he had written it all down, simply and honestly, on one page. There's something Gene Hackman seemed to understand, something most of us spend entire lifetimes carefully avoiding.